Hello, welcome to Presume Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 7 of ADO.NET video series. In this session, we'll learn about calling a stored procedure with output parameters in an ASP.NET web application. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch part 7, 8, and 19 of SQL Server and part 6 of ADO.NET video series. To make it easier for you to find these video series, I'm going to add the YouTube playlist URLs of these video series to the description of this video. Alright, so what we are going to do as part of calling a stored procedure with output parameters, look at this. We'll base our example on this table, TBL employees table, which has got the employee ID, name, gender, and salary columns. In this table, employee ID is an identity column, which means when we insert a row into this table, we don't have to supply a value for that employee ID column. And then we are going to design an ASP.NET web application, which looks similar to this one that you can see on the slide. There is a web form which has got employee name, gender, and salary fields. Now we enter employee name, gender, and salary, and when we click submit, we need to add this employee to this table. Okay, now obviously to do that we need to write a stored procedure which our ASP.NET web application can call. So the stored procedure looks like this. Okay, so let's start step by step from creating the table to creating the stored procedure and then designing this web form and actually writing code. So first let's create this table. So let's flip to SQL Server Management Studio. So I have the script here ready, create table TBL employees, and then we have got employee ID, name, gender, and salary. Employee ID is the identity column. That's important to keep in mind. So let's create this table, execute, command completed successfully. We have created that table in sample database. So if you refresh sample database, you should see the table there. So we see the table. Now we want to insert some sample data into that table. So I have these insert queries here. And if you note the insert query, we are only supplying values for the name, gender, and salary columns. We are not supplying the value for employee ID column. Why? Because that's an identity column and we don't have to supply a value for that when we insert a row. So let's execute these insert queries and insert the sample data. Alright, queries completed successfully. Let's select and see if we have the data from the table. Alright, so we have some sample data to work with. Now let's create a stored procedure that's capable of inserting a row into a table. Now, if you look at the stored procedure, it's very simple. And if you look at the body of the stored procedure, all it has got is 2 lines of code. And in addition to that, there are 4 parameters that the stored procedure is accepting. Now, if we have to insert a row into a table, into this table, specifically TBL employees table, there are 4 columns within that. So we have to supply the values for those columns, except for the employee ID because that's an identity column. So we need to supply value for name, gender, and salary columns. So we are supplying those values using these parameters, name, gender, and salary. And then if you look at the employee ID, this is also specified as a parameter, but note that it's an output parameter. So essentially we are creating here a stored procedure with 3 input parameters which will be used as values for the respective columns, name, salary, and gender. And then employee ID is an output parameter because when we insert a row into this table, name, gender, and salary column values are supplied, and the employee ID column is auto-generated because that's an identity column. Okay, so as soon as we execute this statement, a row gets inserted. The value for the employee ID column is auto-generated, and if we want to retrieve the value for employee ID column, look at this, we are using the scope identity function, okay, which generates the last identity column value. In fact, we have spoken about this in part 8 of SQL Server, how to get the last generated identity column. That's why I told you please watch part 7, 8, and 19 of SQL Server and part 6 of ADO.NET video series before continuing with this session if you haven't already done so. Okay, so if you look at this is a very simple stored procedure which has got just 2 lines of code in that. One line inserts the row into the TBL employees table using the input parameters, and the other row actually selects the identity column value that is generated. Now let's go ahead and test this stored procedure. So to test this, since we have an output, since we need to pass 4 parameters, let's pass them. So first let's create a variable, declare at empid, that's going to be of type integer. Now we want to execute the stored procedure sp add employee, copy that, and now if you look at this, it has got 4 parameters. So name, let's say Josh, and gender is male, and let's say his salary is 7,600. Okay, and we have passed in 3 parameters, but if you look at this stored procedure is also expecting employee ID parameter. So I'm going to pass this employee ID parameter. Since this is an output parameter, you also have to specify the out keyword. So when we execute the stored procedure, what's going to happen? It will insert the row with these values into this table, and the last generated identity column value will be stored into this variable that we are passing in as a parameter. So what you can then do is print the employee ID, and to print we use the print statement. So employee ID is equal to, now the employee ID is going to be present in this variable, so employee ID. Now employee ID is an integer data type, the data type of it, that is integer, and we are concatenating that with string, so we need to cast that to be of type string, and to do that we can use the cast function. So cast employee ID as nvarchar of 2. Okay, so now when we execute this, before we execute that, let's select star from TBL employees to see how many rows we have there. We have got 6 rows now. So when we insert a new row into this table, what's going to happen, and we get a new row with employee ID 7, and that employee ID should be printed here. So let's quickly check that, press F5, could not find the stored procedure. So obviously we have to first create the stored procedure. We haven't created that. So let's create the stored procedure. Execute. Command completed successfully. If you refresh the programmabilities and stored procedures folder, you should see sp add employee there. So now let's execute this. Look at that, 1 row affected, and then employee ID is equal to 7. So we are able to test our stored procedure. It's returning the output parameter as expected. Now let's turn our attention to calling the stored procedure from an ASP.NET web application. Okay, so let's flip to Visual Studio. So I have a web form here which has got, these fields: employee ID, gender, salary. And if you look at this, it's pretty simple. All we have here is a couple of text boxes, a drop down list, a button control, and a label to display the employee ID after we call the stored procedure. And if you look at the HTML, it's again pretty simple. I have this HTML table created to properly align the label names and the text box names. Now I'm going to make this HTML available as part of the in my blog, so that you can actually copy paste that. It's pretty simple. Just this is the hard-coded text, and this is a text box. This is hard-coded text, and this is a drop-down list. And if you look at the drop-down list, I have included male and female list items there. And then we have the text box which can collect salary, and finally a button. So button, and then at last we have a label which displays the message. Okay, so now when we double click this, the event handler for the button click event is generated. Now we need to write the ADO.NET code to execute this stored procedure sp add employee, and then that stored procedure is going to return an output parameter. We are going to harvest the value from that and then display that employee ID that is generated. Okay, so obviously if we want to write any of the ADO.NET code that has to interact with SQL Server, we used to use a namespace system.data.sql client. So system.data.sql client, and we want to read the connection string from web.config file. So if you look at this, the database connection string is within web.config file. I need to read that, so I'm going to use system.configuration namespace. Okay, so first let's read the connection string. So connection string is equal to configuration manager dot connection strings of the name of the connection string. And if you look at that in the web.config, it's called dbcs database connection string. dot connection string. And now we need to create the SQL connection object. It's better to create the SQL connection object using the using statement, because this will automatically close the connection for us. We don't have to close the connection explicitly. So SQL connection con is equal to new SQL connection, and we need to pass in the connection string parameter. Alright, so we created the connection. The next step is to create the SQL command object. So let's create the SQL command. SQL command cmd is equal to new SQL command, and this constructor of the SQL command class is going to take two parameters: the command text that we want to execute and the connection object it will use to execute that command. The command that we want to execute is the stored procedure sp add employee, so we are going to pass that as a string, and then the connection on which we want to execute this command. Okay, now the most important thing that we have to tell to the command object is that it's going to execute a stored procedure and not an ad hoc SQL statement. And how do we tell that? We use the command type property of the command object. So command.command type is equal to, there is an C# enumerator command type enum which we can use to specify that. So the command type is stored procedure. And the next thing that we'll have to do is, if you look at the stored procedure, it's expecting 4 parameters. Okay, so we need to specify all those parameters. And to do that, we can use the parameters collection property of the command object dot add, and we can make use of add with value method, which expects the name of the parameter and the value itself for that parameter. So the name of the first parameter is the name at name, so I'm going to copy that. So at name, and the next thing we have to supply the value for that parameter. So where is name coming from? Name is coming from this text box, and if you look at the ID of that particular text box, it's called as txt employee name. So I'm going to say txt employee name dot text. So that's one parameter, the name parameter. Similarly, we want the gender and salary parameters. So the next parameter is the gender parameter, so let's copy that. Let's go back to Visual Studio, paste that there, copy gender, and gender is coming from the drop down list, so let's call DDL. Let's find out the ID of the drop down list, that is DDL gender. So DDL gender dot, we want the selected value, so we we use that property to retrieve the value that the user has selected, and the final parameter is the salary parameter. So let's copy that, salary, and salary is coming from txt salary text box. Okay, so we have supplied all the input parameters to the command object. The next thing that we have to do is to also pass the output parameter, which is the employee ID. And to pass the output parameter, it's slightly different, because for an output parameter we don't really pass a value, we are going to get a value back. So, but you still need to specify the name of the parameter and the direction and the data type. Let's see what we mean by that. So in order to create, look at this, if I have to associate a parameter to the command object, there are actually several ways. One way is to use this add with value method, which we have just seen. Another way is to simply use this add method. And if you look at what this add method is expecting, again, using this add method, there are several ways. We are going to use one of the overloads where it's expecting a SQL parameter object. So if we want to add a parameter to the command object, one way is to use this add method where we actually pass in a SQL parameter object. So first we need to create a SQL parameter object. So let's create the SQL parameter object. SQL parameter, let's call this output parameter is equal to new SQL parameter. And if you look at this object has got, the SQL parameter object has got several properties for that. The first thing is, obviously we need to specify the parameter name, and if you look at the name of the parameter, it's employee ID. So let's copy that. That's the name of the parameter. And the next important property for an output parameter that you have to specify is the data type, the SQL data type. In SQL Server, what's the data type of this parameter? Integer. So we have to specify that. So output parameter dot SQL DB type is equal to SQL DB type dot integer. So the data type of this output parameter is integer. And the next most important thing that we need to specify is the type of the parameter. By default, when you add a parameter to the parameters collection of the command object, is going to be an input parameter. So if you want the parameter to behave as an output parameter, then you will have to specify the direction. Is it the input or output or both? This employee ID is going to be an output parameter. So I'm going to specify output parameter dot direction is equal to system.data.parameter direction dot output. So these are the three important things for an output parameter that we need to specify: parameter name, data type, and the direction. And then we need to associate this parameter with the command object, and to do that, command.parameters.add. I'm using the add method instead of add with value because I have created a SQL parameter object which can be passed in as a parameter to this add method. So let me copy that and add that there. Alright, so we have associated all the parameters that this command object requires. Now all we have to do is to open the connection and execute the command. So to open the connection, connection.open, and execute the command, command dot. Now this is an insert statement, so we use execute non-query. So command dot execute non-query, and then so we have inserted the row. But then if you remember, we are calling this stored procedure sp_add employee, and this stored procedure is returning an output parameter. So we want to harvest the value of this output parameter, which will be received into this output parameter object. Okay, so if we want to retrieve the value, then we can use that output parameter object. So output parameter dot value. So if you look at this, there is a value property which returns that output parameter value for us. So I'm going to use that property, and if you look at this, this is an integer type, but then I'm going to use string emp id. I'll tell you why I'm using string in just a bit, because I'm going to set the employee ID as the text to a label, so I'm just going to convert that to string. And one more important thing to notice here, look at the value property of the output parameter object. It's of type object. Okay, so we need to typecast that to string because we want to convert that to string. So dot to string. Okay, so we have the employee ID. Now all we have to do is we have a label control that can be used to display the generated employee ID column value. So the ID of the label is LBL message. So let's set the text for that LBL message. So LBL message dot text is equal to, we can simply say employee ID is equal to emp ID. So here I'm actually concatenating this one to the text property of the label. That's why I converted that to string initially rather than to an integer. We know that employee ID is an integer, but since I want to append that to another hard-coded string, I need to convert that later to string again. So I thought I will do the conversion first so that it will save us one step. So employee ID is equal to whatever is the employee ID that we get back using this output parameter. So now if we save everything, run the application, we should get the form where we can enter the employee name, their gender, salary, and then as soon as we click the submit button, the row should be inserted into the SQL server, and then whatever the employee ID is generated, that should be returned back and printed in the label. So let's say Sana is the name of the employee, female, and then salary, let's say 3,570. So if you look at the number of rows that we have got in SQL Server at the moment, there are 7 rows. So now when we click submit, it should insert a new row, and we should get the employee ID as 8. So employee ID is equal to 8, and if you check that in the database, we should have a new record with employee ID is equal to 8. So this demonstrates to us how to call a stored procedure that returns an output parameter in an ASP.NET application. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.